Pick up a piece of coal. It is black. It is heavy. It leaves a mark on your fingers. You have probably held something like it before without thinking much about it. Most people do not think much about coal anymore. It feels like a relic, something from a different era, something your great-grandfather worried about, and you do not have to. But look at it one more time before you put it down. This is not ordinary rock. What you are holding is sunlight, real sunlight, that left the sun and traveled 93 million miles through space and fell through an atmosphere no human being has ever breathed, and landed on the leaves of trees so ancient they existed before flowers, before grass, before birds, before anything with a backbone had figured out how to walk on land. Those leaves caught that light. They pulled carbon out of the air and built themselves from it. They grew tall on it. And when they died, they did not disappear the way things are supposed to disappear. They sank into swamps. They were buried. They were pressed down by time and weight and heat for 300 million years until they became this black, dense thing in your hand. When you burn coal, you are not burning rock. You are releasing sunlight that was trapped before the dinosaurs existed. And the story of how that happened, what those forests looked like, what they did to this planet, on their way to becoming the coal beneath our feet, is one of the strangest stories in the history of life on Earth. It starts long before the first tree. It starts on a planet you would not recognize. Here is something almost no one thinks about. Before forests existed, Earth had no shade. Stand on the surface of this planet 420 million years ago and look around. There is a sky above you. There is wind, there is rain falling, and rivers running to the sea. By every basic measure, this looks like a planet that works, but something is wrong. Something so obvious that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Sunlight hits the ground directly, everywhere, all the time, not filtered through leaves, not broken up by branches, not caught and softened by anything living between you and the sky. The sun just falls straight onto bare rock and pale, thin mats of low-growing green and nothing else. You could walk across this entire planet and never once stand in the shadow of a living thing. The tallest plants on Earth right now are maybe knee-high. In the wettest places, near rivers and coastlines, there are mats of primitive plants spread across the rock like a thin green skin. There are some early plants that have figured out how to move water through their bodies, which is an achievement. But none of them are tall. None of them cast a shadow worth mentioning. None of them have anything you would call a trunk. Now here is the thing that makes this strange, rather than just empty. This planet is not dying. This planet is thriving. The oceans are extraordinary. Reef systems that dwarf anything alive today. Armored fish, the size of pickup trucks. Creatures so strange and so varied that most of them have no living relatives you could point to. The oceans of this period are among the most biologically rich environments Earth has ever produced. Life is not absent. Life is everywhere. But life on land is flat. That is the word that matters. Flat. Not in terms of geography, in terms of biology. Every creature living on land is competing for the exact same layer of space, the same band of sunlight, the same surface. There is no above and there is no below in any meaningful ecological sense. The ocean figured out depth hundreds of millions of years ago. A creature in the ocean can be a surface dweller or a mid-water hunter or a bottom feeder. And those are genuinely different worlds with genuinely different rules. 3 dimensions, fully used. Land has one. And the reason land is stuck with one comes down to a problem so physical and so specific that once you understand it, you realize how completely it locked everything in. If you want to be tall on land, you have to hold yourself up. In the ocean, the water, does that work for you? Buoyancy is free. Take a creature out of the water and it collapses under its own weight. On land, every inch of height is a structural problem. Every foot you rise off the ground puts more stress on everything below. And the materials that early land plants had available, soft, flexible tissue built from cellulose, work fine close to the ground and fail completely when you try to stack them high. Cellulose resists being pulled apart, but press down on it and it buckles. A plant built only from cellulose can get maybe a few feet tall before physics wins. So land stayed flat. For a very long time, land stayed flat. Something is going to change that. Something is going to solve the structural problem in a way that does not just make plants taller, but sets off a chain of consequences that will reach into the ocean, into the atmosphere, into the bodies of every animal that will ever walk on this planet. The solution is coming, and it is going to start not with what grows above the ground, but with what goes into it. Think about what it actually takes to live on land. Not survive. Actually live. Grow. Compete. Leave something behind. The ocean makes life easy in ways you never notice, until you try to imagine taking them away. Water surrounds you, so you never dry out. Nutrients arrive at your surface. The water itself holds you up. Your reproductive cells have somewhere to swim. The ocean is, in a very real sense, doing half the work of being alive for every creature living in it. Land does none of that. And yet something started moving onto land anyway. Not because land was better, because around 450 million years ago, certain conditions near coastlines and river edges made land survivable for certain very simple organisms. Just barely survivable, and just barely turned out to be enough to start something that would not stop. The first problem was immediate and almost embarrassingly basic. Water. A single cell exposed to open air without any protection dries out and dies in minutes. Not hours. Minutes. This was not a challenge to overcome gradually. It was a wall. Before any organism could do anything interesting on land, it had to solve the drying problem completely or die before it mattered. The solution was a coating, a thin, waxy layer over the surface of the plant that slowed water loss dramatically. Simple, almost too simple, but so effective that virtually every land plant alive today still uses the same basic approach. From the moss on a shaded rock to the leaves of the tallest redwood on Earth, that thin film, invisible to the naked eye, was one of the most important biological inventions in the history of life. Without it, nothing that has ever grown on land could have gotten started. But sealing the surface created a new problem immediately. If your surface is sealed to keep water in, it is also sealed to keep gases out. And plants need carbon dioxide to photosynthesize. A perfectly waterproof plant is a plant that cannot feed itself. The solution was pores. Tiny openings, called stomata, scattered across the surface of the leaf. Each one controlled by a pair of cells that swell or shrink based on local water pressure. When water is available, the pores open and the plant breathes. When conditions turn dry, the pores close. No brain required. No decision made. Just two cells responding to their immediate chemistry. Open or shut. And the whole system running on that instruction for 400 million years without fundamental redesign. Now the plant can stay wet enough to survive and exchange gases. But there is still a third problem. And this one gets harder as the plant tries to grow. How does water get from the ground to the leaves? For something small and close to the ground, diffusion and capillary action can manage it. But the moment a plant tries to grow taller, the distance between the water in the soil and the cells that need it starts working against everything. You cannot push water 30 feet upward by diffusion. You need something more like plumbing. The solution was a vascular system. Specialized cells arranged in long, continuous tubes running from the roots through the stem to the leaves. Water moves upward through these tubes, not by being pushed from below, but by being pulled from above. As leaves release water vapor into the air and create tension in the column below, drawing more water up from the roots. The physics involved is counterintuitive and elegant. As long as the column of water is unbroken, the pull at the top transmits all the way down to the roots, the taller the plant. The longer the column, but the same basic mechanism works. This was the piece of infrastructure that made taller plants conceivable. With vascular tissue, the ceiling on height started moving. But there was a fourth problem, and this one came from outside the plant entirely. Rock is not food. The minerals that plants need, phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, calcium, dozens of others, are locked inside the crystal structures of rock and mineral sediment. They are present in enormous quantities and completely inaccessible to any root that just pushes against the surface. The solution did not come from the plants themselves. It came from a partnership. Fungi had been working on rock long before plants arrived on land. Certain fungi make a living by secreting acids and enzymes that break down complex materials and extract what they need from the wreckage. Some of these fungi discovered, very early in the history of land life, that they could do something mutually useful with plant roots. The fungus would extend its thread-like filaments deep into rock and soil, breaking down minerals and extracting nutrients far beyond what any root could reach on its own. In exchange, the plant would supply the fungus with sugars produced by photosynthesis, energy the fungus had no way to make for itself. Neither one could do alone what they could do together. And the partnership worked so well that it has been running, essentially unchanged in its basic logic, for 400 million years. The fungi in the soil beneath a modern forest are doing the same deal their ancestors worked out before trees existed. 4 problems, 4 solutions. The plant can survive on land, exchange gases, move water upward, and pull nutrients from rock. But there is still one thing none of those solutions address. How tall can it actually grow? All the vascular tissue in the world cannot help a plant stay upright if the material it is made of cannot bear its own weight. Cellulose gets you off the ground. It does not get you into the sky. And the sky, it turns out, is where everything changes. Something is about to solve that last problem. And when it does, the word tall is going to mean something that has never meant anything on land before. Imagine being the first living thing tall enough to cast a real shadow, not the faint smear of darkness from a low mat of vegetation. An actual shadow, the kind that moves across the ground as the sun moves, the kind that creates a patch of cool and dim that other things begin to organize their lives around, the kind that means something is up there, between you and the sky, taking light before it ever reaches you. Nothing on land had ever done this. And then, around 385 million years ago, something did. The molecule that made it possible is called lignin. Lignin is a polymer that gets deposited inside the walls of certain plant cells. As a cell fills with lignin, it hardens. The wall goes from flexible to rigid. The cell stops being a living cell in the conventional sense and becomes something closer to a structural element. A tiny column of reinforced material, adding its strength to the larger column around it. Stack enough of these cells together in the right arrangement, and you have something that can bear weight in a way that cellulose alone never could. You have wood. What makes lignin remarkable beyond its strength is its chemistry. It repels water. It resists breakdown. Most biological molecules, given enough time and the right conditions, will decompose. Lignin, under many conditions, simply does not. You can bury a piece of lignin-rich wood in wet soil and come back years later and find it essentially intact. That durability is going to matter enormously. But first, the structural achievement. A plant cell wall, reinforced with lignin, can hold weight in a way that changes everything about what is possible on land. Not just a little taller, not twice as tall, dramatically, almost incomprehensibly taller than anything that came before. 30 meters, 40 meters, a trunk a meter across, branches extending horizontally from that trunk, each one carrying hundreds of leaves, each leaf catching light, each leaf photosynthesizing. The tree that most paleontologists point to as the first truly successful woody forest tree is called Archaeopteryx. It appeared around 375 million years ago and spread across enormous stretches of what are now North America, Europe, and Asia in what amounts, geologically speaking, to almost no time at all. It looked strange by any modern standard. Its trunk was solid wood, but its branches carried fronds that looked more like fern leaves than anything from a tree today. It had no flowers, no fruit, no seeds in the modern sense. If you walked into a forest of Archaeopteryx, you would not recognize most of what you were seeing. But it was 30 meters tall, and it had wood, and those two facts changed the world. Here is what happens to a landscape the first time something genuinely tall grows in it. Below the canopy of Archaeopteryx, conditions are different from conditions in the open. Temperature is lower, humidity is higher, wind is stopped at the surface rather than reaching the ground. Light is filtered, dimmer, rearranged in its spectrum by passage through living leaves. The ground beneath that canopy receives a fraction of the energy that open ground receives. That difference is a world. Shade-tolerant plants can grow where before they would have been outcompeted in full sun. Organisms that need moisture and cool can survive where before the open sun would have killed them. The vertical structure of a forest creates more ecological space in a square kilometer than flat ground could support in 100 square kilometers. Every creature that has ever lived in or around a forest, every bird that builds a nest in branches, every insect that moves through leaf litter, every mammal that shelters in roots, is living inside an architecture it did not build. Plants built it. Wood made it possible. And Archaeopteryx was the first contractor. But here is the part of this story that nobody talks about when they talk about the first trees. Lignin, the molecule that made all of this possible, was something the planet had never encountered before. In certain environments, particularly the wet, low-lying areas where early forests were spreading, dead wood accumulated in ways that the existing decomposition systems were not fully equipped to handle. Fallen trees piled up, were buried under sediment, in oxygen-poor conditions. The breakdown that would happen quickly in a well-aerated modern forest happened slowly, or did not go to completion at all. The carbon inside all of that wood Carbon pulled from the atmosphere by photosynthesis was not going back into the air. It was going into the ground. And in the ocean, thousands of miles from every fallen tree, something was beginning to change that no creature alive could see coming. There is a sentence that stops most people cold when they first hear it. Before forests, there was no deep living soil, not thinner soil, not younger soil. No soil in the sense that any farmer, any gardener, any person who has ever pushed their fingers into dark, rich earth would recognize as soil. The ground covering most of Earth's land surface before woody plants arrived was rock, weathered rock, mineral sediment, and thin crusts of microbial life. It had no organic layer worth speaking of, no dark upper horizon full of decomposing matter and fungal networks, no structure created by generations of roots, growing and dying and being replaced, no earthworms. Because earthworms need organic material to eat, and there was almost none. What we call soil is not a geological product. It is a biological one. And the primary engineers who built it were not bacteria or fungi or worms. They were trees. And they built it not with their leaves or their trunks. They built it with their roots. This is the part of the forest story that almost never gets told. Because roots are invisible. Everything dramatic about a tree happens above ground where you can see it. The canopy, the height, the shadow, but the work that roots did to this planet, beginning roughly 385 million years ago, is as consequential as anything that happened above the surface. The fossil record from this period preserves something remarkable. Sites in New York State preserve evidence of some of the earliest forest ecosystems we know of. The fossils found there include not just the stumps of early trees, but the traces of their root systems, spreading outward through the ancient substrate, branching and rebranching into patterns immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever pulled a plant from the ground. Those roots were not shallow. They were going deep, into rock, into the mineral substrate that had never been penetrated by anything living at this scale before. So, what actually happens when a root enters rock? The root secretes organic acids as it grows. Those acids react with the mineral surfaces they contact and begin breaking down the crystal structures inside the rock at the molecular level. Silicate minerals, the most common minerals in the continental crust, start to come apart under this chemical attack. Elements locked inside those structures for hundreds of millions of years. Calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium begin releasing as ions into the water moving through the soil, and then the fungi take over. The mycorrhizal partnership described in the last chapter becomes, in the context of root chemistry, something almost industrial in scale. Fungal threads extend from the root surface deep into surrounding rock, producing their own acids and enzymes, penetrating microscopic cracks that no root could ever reach. A single tree, through its root system and associated fungi, is chemically attacking rock across an area and at a depth that dwarfs what the tree occupies above ground. The combined effect has a name: biological weathering. And when the first true forests spread across the land, biological weathering began happening at a scale that had no precedent in 4 billion years of Earth history. The results were physical, and they were immediate. Real soil started forming. Mineral particles from weathered rock mixed with organic material from decomposing roots and fallen leaves. Fungal networks bound these particles into stable aggregates. Bacterial communities moved in to process the organic matter. over thousands and then millions of years. This process built actual soil, deep and structured and biologically active, in ways that the thin mineral crusts of the pre-forest world were not. Rivers changed. Before root systems stabilized the ground, rivers on land were wide, shallow, and constantly shifting. They braided across floodplains in dozens of changing channels, carrying enormous loads of loose sediment that had nothing holding it in place. The moment root systems began binding soil particles together, riverbanks gained structural strength. Rivers began cutting downward instead of spreading outward. They narrowed. They deepened. They became the kind of rivers we would recognize today, with defined channels capable of maintaining a course for thousands of years. The entire drainage geometry of the continents was being rewritten. But those two changes, soil and rivers, as significant as they were, are not the reason this chapter exists. This chapter exists because of what happened when it rained. Before root systems, rain falling on bare rock and thin sediment had essentially one option: run off, fast. The ground was largely impermeable, so water moved laterally across the surface, picking up whatever loose particles it could carry, dumping those particles into rivers, and from rivers into the ocean. Erosion was intense. Sediment loads were enormous. Root systems changed the physics of rainfall at the surface. Roots physically open the soil, creating channels and pores through which water can move downward rather than only sideways. The organic material accumulating in soil absorbs water and holds it. Fungal networks do the same. A forested landscape soaks up a dramatically larger percentage of rainfall than bare rock ever could. More water moving down through soil means more water in contact with rock for longer periods. More chemical weathering happening slowly underground. More minerals dissolving. More elements releasing into the water that eventually finds its way to streams and rivers. And among those elements, one matters more than all the others combined: phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of the most important elements in biology. Every molecule of DNA contains it. The energy currency of every living cell is built around it. Without phosphorus, the basic chemistry of life does not work. In the ocean, where most of Earth's life was living during this period, phosphorus is typically the limiting nutrient, the element whose scarcity puts a ceiling on how much biological activity can happen. The ocean has always had phosphorus, but it has almost never had enough. In rock, phosphorus exists in enormous quantities, locked inside mineral structures for hundreds of millions of years, unable to do anything, unable to enter the biological world. As long as it stays in the rock, it might as well not exist. Root systems were unlocking it. Every ton of rock chemically attacked by a forest released some phosphorus into the water moving through the soil. Every rainstorm carried some of those dissolved phosphorus ions into streams. Every stream carried them to rivers. Every river carried them toward the coast. For a few million years, as forests spread across more and more of the land surface, the rate of phosphorus flowing from the continents into the ocean increased steadily, continuously, driven by the patient expansion of root systems into rock that had never been chemically attacked at this depth or at this scale. The ocean had no way to refuse what the land was sending. And what the ocean did with all of that phosphorus? What happened when one of the most complex marine ecosystems in Earth's history suddenly received far more of its limiting nutrient than it had ever received before? Is a story that begins with something that looks like abundance. It does not end that way. The Devonian Ocean was extraordinary. Picture a reef system that made the modern Great Barrier Reef look modest. Not in length, but in density, in three-dimensional complexity, in the sheer strangeness of what was building it. Stromatoporoid sponges constructed massive carbonate frameworks across shallow tropical seas. Tabulate and rugose corals rose from the sea floor in forms that no living coral has replicated since. Crinoids carpeted the bottom in some areas so densely the seafloor looked like a meadow of feathers. Ammonoids moved through the open water. Brachiopods clustered in every available niche. And then there were the fish. Dunkleosteus was an armored predator that may have reached 9 meters in length. It had no teeth in the conventional sense. Instead, it had bony plates that worked like self-sharpening scissors, capable of generating a bite force that most modern sharks cannot come close to matching. Smaller armored fish called placoderms moved through the shallows in hundreds of species. Coelacanths were there. Lungfish were there. In certain shallow coastal areas, some fish with strangely fleshy fins were spending time in very shallow water and occasionally doing something that no vertebrate had ever done before. This was the ocean that the forests were about to reach. Not physically. Forests do not move into oceans. But the phosphorus that root systems were unlocking from continental rock was flowing down rivers and arriving at the coast. And the ocean was receiving it. And at first, the ocean responded the way any ecosystem responds when it gets more of what it needs. It grew. Algae and cyanobacteria at the base of the marine food web responded to increased phosphorus the way any organism responds to more of its limiting resource. They multiplied. Blooms spread across the surface of coastal waters. More algae meant more food for the creatures that ate algae, and more food for the creatures that ate those creatures. In the short term, more phosphorus looked like good news for an ocean already full of life. But here is what happens when the phosphorus increase is not a temporary fluctuation. Here is what happens when it is a sustained trend that continues for millions of years, as forests keep expanding and root systems keep going deeper into rock. The algae blooms do not stabilize at a new higher level. They overshoot. Blooms grow dense enough to block light from reaching anything below the surface. And when those blooms die, which they do on a timescale of days to weeks, the dead organic matter sinks. Bacteria decompose it. And decomposition consumes oxygen, enormous amounts of oxygen. In shallow, nearshore waters, oxygen gets replenished from the surface and from photosynthesis in well-lit water. But in deeper water, in bottom water, that is not being mixed with the surface fast enough. The oxygen consumed by decomposing algae is not replaced. The water goes hypoxic, then anoxic. In anoxic water, the most complex life cannot survive. Not because anything attacked it, because the water it breathed stopped containing what it needed to breathe. The geological record of the late Devonian preserves the evidence of this happening not in one place, but across ocean basins worldwide. Black shales, a rock type that forms specifically in oxygen-depleted bottom water, where organic material is preserved rather than decomposed, appear in the record, in quantities and distributions that tell a consistent story. Repeated episodes of anoxia, spreading through the deeper and bottom waters of the Devonian Ocean, correlating with the period when land plant root systems were expanding most rapidly. Something was pulling oxygen out of the deep ocean on a global scale. And while that was happening in the water, something else was happening in the sky. Forests pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. This is basic photosynthesis. Carbon in, oxygen out. Energy stored. Under normal circumstances, when a plant dies and decomposes, that carbon goes back into the atmosphere and the cycle closes. But as the last chapter described, the wood of early forests was accumulating in ways that prevented full decomposition in certain environments. Carbon pulled from the atmosphere was not returning to it. It was going into the ground. Carbon dioxide levels were falling. A planet with less carbon dioxide in its atmosphere is a cooler planet. Temperatures were shifting. The ocean was changing not just in its chemistry, but in its circulation, its stratification, the way heat and nutrients moved through it. The forests were not watching any of this happen. There was no watching. There was only growing and rooting and pulling carbon from the sky and sending phosphorus to the sea, and doing all of it without any sense of consequence. Because consequence is a concept that requires awareness, and there was none, but the consequences were real. And they were building towards something in the Devonian Ocean that the most successful marine ecosystem in Earth's history had no way of preparing for. The reefs were already showing stress. In the fossil record, diversity begins declining in some marine groups before the worst of what is coming arrives. The warning signs are there, in the rock, layered and preserved and waiting for someone 370 million years later to know how to read them. The forests kept growing. The rivers kept running. The phosphorus kept flowing. And in the deep water of the Devonian Ocean, in the cold and the dark, where oxygen was thinning, the most complex marine ecosystems Earth had ever built were running out of time. Around 372 million years ago, something began in the world's oceans that would take millions of years to fully play out. Not a single event, not a day that changed everything. What happened to the Devonian Ocean was more like what happens to a building that has been quietly losing its structural integrity for years. From the outside, everything looks fine. And then, in a span of time that feels sudden only because you are not watching the slow damage accumulating underneath, it does not look fine anymore. The late Devonian crisis came in pulses, waves of ecological collapse separated by partial recoveries, each wave leaving the ocean biologically poorer than before, until the cumulative damage added up to one of the most severe biological disruptions in the history of animal life on this planet. By some estimates, somewhere between 70 and 80% of all marine species disappeared across this interval. 7 or 8 out of every 10 species living in the ocean. Not all at once, not cleanly, but gone, across a span of time that is brief by geological standards, even if it is almost impossible to hold in the mind by any other measure. To understand the scale of what was lost, you have to go back to the reef. The Devonian reef systems were not simply large, they were ecologically mature in a way that takes hundreds of millions of years to produce. The organisms building those reefs had been evolving their relationships with each other, their structural dependencies, their chemical partnerships, since before the Devonian began. Stromatoporoid sponges and tabulate corals had been constructing frameworks together long enough that removing one began to compromise everything the other depended on. Their relationship was not just biological. It was architectural. When the anoxic pulses hit the deeper and bottom waters of Devonian seas, the consequences did not stay in the deep water. They moved upward through the food web and outward through the ecosystem in ways that the reef organisms had no capacity to adapt to quickly enough. Nutrient dynamics shifted. Water chemistry changed. Temperatures fluctuated as atmospheric carbon dioxide continued falling. The reefs, which had survived previous environmental stress through their biological complexity, discovered that complexity has limits. Complex systems are resilient to the kinds of stress they have encountered before. they are fragile to the kinds they have not. The Devonian reefs collapsed. Reef ecosystems of this kind would not recover for roughly 10 million years after the crisis peaked. Some researchers put the recovery time higher. The carbonate framework, that had been a continuous feature of shallow marine environments for over 100 million years, essentially vanished from the fossil record and did not return in recognizable form for longer than the entire span of time that has passed since the last dinosaur walked on Earth. The ocean floor that had been covered in biological construction was left bare. A silence in the rock that you can find in outcrops on every continent where rocks of this age are exposed. The armored fish did not survive either. The placoderms, that extraordinary group of jawed fish that had diversified into hundreds of species and dominated Devonian seas from the tropics to the poles, did not make it through as a group. The lineage that produced Dunkleosteus and thousands of other species, some of the most successful vertebrates that had ever lived up to that point, ended, not reduced, not diminished to a handful of survivors. Ended. The last placoderm died somewhere around the close of the Devonian, and nothing like them has existed since. Now here is where the story requires honesty. Forests may have been a significant driver of the chemical changes that made the Devonian crisis as severe as it was. The phosphorus runoff from expanding root systems very likely contributed to the eutrophication and anoxia that suffocated so much of what lived in deeper waters. The carbon burial by non-decomposing wood pulled carbon dioxide down in ways that affected global temperatures. These were forces operating at planetary scale over millions of years. They did not act alone. Volcanic activity was part of the picture. Sea level changes were part of it. The position of continents affected ocean circulation in ways that are still being studied. The late Devonian was a system under stress from multiple directions at once. But what the growing body of evidence increasingly suggests is this. The spread of deep-rooted forests across the land was one of the forces that pushed an ocean already under stress past thresholds it could not easily come back from. The forests did not intend any of this. Intention is a concept with no meaning in this context. They grew because growing was what they did, and growing had consequences that reached into the ocean and rearranged it in ways that took millions of years to play out. Now comes the part of this story that requires you to hold two things in your mind at the same time. Among all the species that lived through the Devonian crisis, one group survived in ways that mattered more than any other group for what this planet would eventually become. The lobe-finned fish. Lobe-finned fish had a particular arrangement of their fins that distinguished them from most other fish. Rather than the thin web and ray structure of a typical fish fin, lobe fins had a fleshy, muscular base with an internal bone structure, and the bones inside those fleshy bases were arranged in a pattern that, if you know what you are looking at, is immediately recognizable. One bone connecting to two bones connecting to a cluster of smaller bones, a cluster of smaller bones connecting to even smaller bones, radiating outward. That is the basic blueprint of a tetrapod limb, of your arm, of your leg, of the forelimb of every land vertebrate that has ever walked, or crawled, or climbed, or run on this planet. Lobe-finned fish had been experimenting with shallow water and air breathing before the crisis hit. Some species had functional lungs alongside their gills. Some could move through very shallow water using their fins in ways that looked nothing like how other fish moved. They were not land animals, but they were positioned, biologically, in ways that would matter enormously when the crisis reshaped the ecological landscape around them. The crisis removed competitors. It removed predators that had dominated the spaces around shallow coastal margins. It created conditions. Specifically, the oxygen-variable shallow waters that the worst of the anoxia was generating near the coasts. That lobe-finned fish were better equipped to tolerate than most of what had previously shared those spaces with them. The crisis did not design their future. It did not select them in any purposeful sense, but it reshaped the world in which some of their descendants survived and expanded, and some of those descendants, in the shallow, warm margins of the late Devonian world, began doing something that no vertebrate had done before. They came onto land. The first tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates capable of supporting themselves out of water, appear in the fossil record at or near the end of the Devonian period. Acanthostega, ichthyostega, creatures with limbs that could bear weight, with lungs capable of breathing air, with body plans that were neither fish nor land animal, but somewhere in the uncertain space between. Not elegant, not optimized, but there, on land, in the fossil record, at the end of the most severe marine crisis since complex animal life began. We exist because of a crisis, and the crisis happened, in significant part, because trees learned how to grow roots. Sit with that for a moment before moving on. The chain that runs from lignin to tall trees to deep roots, to phosphorus in the ocean, to anoxic water, to collapsing reefs, to dying placoderms, to surviving lobe-finned fish, to tetrapods hauling themselves onto land, is not a chain anyone designed. It is not a chain anyone could have seen from any point along it. It is simply what happened when one set of consequences triggered the next. Across hundreds of millions of years, without plan or intention or any awareness that a chain was being built at all, the ocean crisis ended. Slowly, the way large disruptions to planetary systems always end. Not with a clean resolution, but with a gradual restabilization, a settling into new configurations that are different from what came before, but functional in their own way. What came next was not a recovery into the world that had existed before the crisis. It was something stranger, and in many ways, more extraordinary. The Devonian ended. The Carboniferous began. Around 359 million years ago. The worst of the marine crisis had passed, and the survivors were finding out what kind of world they had inherited. The ocean was quieter, simpler, a long way from the extraordinary reef complexity of the Devonian, but alive and slowly rebuilding. On land, something different was happening. While the oceans were recovering, the forests were not recovering. They were expanding. The conditions that had contributed to so much stress in the marine world, falling carbon dioxide, a cooler and wetter climate in many tropical regions, were in many ways ideal conditions for forest growth on land. And the land that forests were spreading across was increasingly well suited to what they needed. Large stretches of tropical lowland, warm, wet, close to sea level, connected by the assembling pieces of what would eventually become the supercontinent Pangaea. Into those lowlands, the forests built something that has no equivalent anywhere on Earth today. Not a forest in any sense you would recognize from a walk through any woods that currently exist on this planet. Something larger and stranger than that word usually contains. The dominant trees were called lepidodendron. They grew to heights of 30 or 40 meters on trunks that were not round and rough-barked like a modern tree, but ridged and patterned with diamond-shaped scars where leaves had once attached, giving the surface a texture closer to a reptile's skin than anything you would find on a tree today. There were no branches lower down the trunk, no gradually widening silhouette. Just a long, smooth column rising out of the swamp water and spreading into a relatively small crown near the top. If you stood at the base of one, You would not feel like you were in a forest. You would feel like you were standing among columns in some enormous structure that had no roof. Calamites grew alongside them. Relatives of the modern horsetail, scaled up to 20 meters or more. Their hollow, jointed stems standing in dense stands wherever water collected. Seed ferns spread through whatever space remained between the larger trees. Tree ferns added another layer of frond-bearing canopy below the lepidodendron crowns. And everywhere there was water, which in these lowlands meant almost everywhere. The surface was covered in a floating mat of smaller plants and the accumulated debris of everything falling from above. The light inside this forest was green, heavily filtered through layer after layer of fronds and leaves. It would have felt less like daylight and more like being underwater. The air was still. The humidity was total. Standing water was everywhere in the lower areas, dark and tannic from the organic material dissolving in it, smelling of things decomposing slowly in conditions that were not quite right for decomposition. Now add the animals. The Carboniferous is when land ecosystems first became genuinely complex in 3 dimensions. The forests created vertical habitat that had never existed before, and life moved into it with the same filling logic that water uses when you pour it into a container. Every available space gets occupied eventually, if the conditions support life at all. Some of what moved in was enormous. Arthropleura was a millipede, a relative of the small creatures you find under rocks in your garden, but scaled to dimensions that changed the emotional meaning of the word entirely. The largest specimens reached over 2 meters in length, more than 6 feet of armored, segmented body moving through the Carboniferous forest floor on dozens of legs. Nothing like it has existed since the Carboniferous ended. Meganeura was a dragonfly, or close enough to one that calling it anything else would be misleading. With a wingspan approaching 70 centimeters, nearly 2.5 feet from wingtip to wingtip. A dragonfly the size of a crow, hunting above the swamps with compound eyes and grasping legs, running the same basic predatory strategy its smaller descendants run today. The reason for their size was the air itself. Insects and arthropods breathe through a passive system of tubes that carry air directly to their tissues. The system is efficient, but it has a size limit. The tubes can only move oxygen effectively up to a certain body diameter. Beyond that, the inner tissues cannot get enough oxygen, and the animal dies. In an atmosphere with significantly more oxygen than today, that size limit rises. The body can get bigger, while the same tube system still delivers what the tissues need. Atmospheric oxygen during the Carboniferous may have climbed well above the 21% of today, possibly reaching 30% or higher during certain intervals, according to some models. The reason it was climbing was exactly what the last few chapters have been describing. Forests were pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and burying it in their dead wood without fully returning it through decomposition. Every ton of carbon buried in the swamps was a ton of carbon dioxide removed from the air. And for every carbon atom removed by photosynthesis, a corresponding oxygen atom was released. As burial rates increased, oxygen levels climbed. The giant insects were living proof of what the forests had done to the chemistry of the sky. They were also living in a world that was, in geological terms, storing up something with consequences no creature in it could possibly have imagined. The swamps were everywhere. The trees were dying at the rate that trees in any productive forest always die. But in these swamps, in these particular conditions of standing water and limited oxygen and slow decomposition, the dead trees were not disappearing. They were accumulating, layer after layer, year after year, century after century, building up in the waterlogged sediment below. The swamps were making something. something that would sit in the earth for 300 million years, invisible and inert, and carrying within it the stored energy of every leaf that had ever caught sunlight in these extraordinary forests. And one day, long after every creature in this chapter had been extinct for longer than mammals have existed, something would find it and decide to burn it. Think about what happens to a dead tree in a forest today. You have probably seen this without thinking about it. A tree falls, maybe from wind, maybe from disease, maybe just from age. It hits the ground, and the forest absorbs the sound and goes quiet again. And then, if you come back in 5 years, the tree is softer. Come back in 10, and it is crumbling at the edges. Come back in 20, and it is barely a shape in the leaf litter, a slightly raised line in the ground where something large once was. The fungi did that. The bacteria did that. Organisms so small you cannot see them, without a microscope, dismantled a tree that may have stood for a century, broke it down into its component parts, and returned those parts to the system. The carbon that was locked in the wood went back into the air as carbon dioxide. The nutrients went back into the soil. The cycle closed. This is how forests work now. This is how they have worked for a very long time. This is not how they worked in the Carboniferous, in the great swamp forests of the Carboniferous period. Dead trees did not disappear. They fell into standing water. They sank into waterlogged sediment. They were buried under the weight of more trees falling on top of them and more sediment washing in from surrounding higher ground. And in those conditions, the machinery of decomposition that handles things so efficiently in a modern forest ran into problems it could not easily solve. The key is oxygen. Decomposition, the kind that actually breaks organic material all the way down and returns carbon to the atmosphere, requires oxygen. The fungi and bacteria doing that work are aerobic organisms. They need oxygen to run their metabolic processes, the same way you need oxygen to run yours. In a well-aerated modern forest, oxygen is everywhere. In the standing water and waterlogged sediment of a Carboniferous swamp, oxygen was scarce. Below a certain depth in the sediment, it was essentially absent. In those conditions, breakdown happened slowly, or it started and stopped partway through. The complex organic molecules in wood, particularly lignin, which resists breakdown even under good conditions, became nearly impervious in oxygen-poor water. Dead trees accumulated faster than they could be processed. Layer, compressed layer, year by year and century by century. The organic material piled up. The technical name for what that material became is peat. You can find peat today in the bogs of Ireland and Scotland and the vast wetlands of Siberia. Dark and spongy, and smelling of something ancient. So high in organic carbon content that people have been cutting it and burning it for heat for thousands of years. Modern peat bogs are slow-motion versions of what the Carboniferous swamps were doing at a scale and rate that the modern world has nothing to compare to. Now add time. Geological time. The peat layers of the Carboniferous were not sitting still. As the land surface shifted and sea levels rose and fell, as the geometry of the continents slowly changed, sediment accumulated on top of those peat deposits. The weight above increased. The pressure increased. The temperature increased with depth. Because the interior of the Earth is warm and temperature rises as you go down. Under sufficient heat and pressure, over sufficient time, peat transforms. First into lignite, the softest form of coal, brown and crumbly, and still faintly recognizable as compressed plant material if you look closely enough. Deeper burial and more time produce bituminous coal, black and brittle, the coal that ran the Industrial Revolution. The deepest burial and the greatest pressure produce anthracite, the hardest and most carbon-rich form, which burns hotter and cleaner than either of the others. The coal deposits of Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Kentucky and Illinois, of England and Wales and Germany and Poland, of China and Russia and Australia. Every significant coal deposit on Earth formed primarily during this period, from the same basic process. Swamp forests died and were buried. Burial prevented full decomposition. Time and pressure transformed the buried organic material into coal. Here is what that actually means. Every ton of coal is stored photosynthesis. It is light that fell from the sun onto leaves, was converted into carbon through the chemistry of living cells, and was then locked away from the atmosphere before it could return to it. The energy in coal is not chemical energy in the ordinary sense. It is solar energy, collected by living things and preserved by geology for hundreds of millions of years. When you burn coal, you are not generating energy. You are releasing energy that was captured and stored before the first dinosaur existed. Now for the part of this story that science has spent decades working out and has not fully resolved yet, and is honest enough to say so. For a long time, a very compelling explanation for why so much carbon was buried during the Carboniferous went like this. Lignin, the structural molecule in wood, was so chemically novel when it first appeared that the biological world had not yet evolved effective ways to break it down. Fungi capable of decomposing lignin-rich wood efficiently had not yet developed. So the wood piled up, the carbon accumulated. The coal formed because decomposers simply had not caught up with what trees had invented. It is a beautiful story. It is clean and mechanistic and satisfying in the way that the best scientific explanations are satisfying. And it is probably not the complete picture. Research in recent decades has complicated this narrative. The relationship between fungal evolution and the timing of coal formation turns out to be harder to establish than the original story suggested. Fungi, capable of breaking down lignin, may have been present earlier than the simple version allows. And the conditions that produced Carboniferous coal appear to involve multiple factors working together, not a single biological bottleneck. What those factors were is clearer now than it used to be. Vast tropical lowlands sitting at or below sea level, providing the standing water that slowed decomposition regardless of what decomposers were capable of. High biological productivity driven by warm, wet conditions, producing more organic material than any decomposition system could process at that rate. Fluctuating sea levels that repeatedly buried peat deposits under fresh sediment before decomposition could go to completion. Tectonic conditions that allowed those buried layers to subside gradually rather than being exposed and eroded. When all of those factors aligned together for tens of millions of years across vast areas of the tropical continents, the result was coal at a scale the world has not seen before or since. Coal was not made because trees died. Everything dies. Coal was made because for a specific window of time, in specific places, with specific geological and biological conditions, death could be buried faster than it could be returned to the air. That window eventually closed. Climates shifted as Pangaea assembled. The great tropical swamp forests retreated. The conditions that had produced coal on this extraordinary scale became rare and then rarer. What had accumulated during the window stayed where it was, in the rock, under the surface, on every continent, in quantities that represent tens of millions of years of captured sunlight, waiting for 300 million years. It just waited. something changes when you realize the ground is not passive. Most of us move through the world with an assumption about the land beneath our feet. It is background. It is stage setting. Mountains form and rivers cut. Valleys and earthquakes occasionally remind you that things are moving down there. But the basic character of the ground feels fixed, given, something that has always been approximately what it is and will continue to be. That assumption is wrong. And the first forests are why it is wrong. Before trees, the land surface of this planet was fundamentally different in its chemistry, its structure, its relationship to the atmosphere, and its capacity to support complex life. After trees, it was transformed into something that made the subsequent history of terrestrial life not just possible, but in many ways inevitable. The transformation took roughly 100 million years to reach its full expression. It left behind soil under every productive landscape on Earth. It left behind the oxygen content of the air. It left behind the coal that is still buried in quantities we have not come close to exhausting. And it left behind us. Your lungs belong to a lineage whose path onto land unfolded in a world the first forests helped create. The lobe-finned fish that survived the Devonian crisis, that dragged themselves into the shallows and eventually onto the land that forest roots had built, were the beginning of the chain that produced every land vertebrate that has ever lived. Every amphibian, every reptile, every mammal, every bird. The entire 370 million year history of vertebrate life on land runs through those fish, which survived because of the specific conditions the Devonian crisis generated, which the forests helped cause. That is not metaphor. That is causation. Long, complicated, multi-step causation across hundreds of millions of years. But causation. The soil under every farm that has helped build every human civilization sits in a medium that forests created. Not forests alone, and not without the contributions of every generation of biological activity since, but the basic architecture of living soil. The relationship between mineral particles and organic matter, and fungal networks and bacterial communities, was pioneered by the root systems of the first forests. When a farmer in Iowa or Ukraine or the Yangtze River Valley turns over dark, rich topsoil, they are working with a material that required hundreds of millions of years to develop the template for. The oxygen in the air right now is a product of billions of years of photosynthesis. But the Carboniferous forests made a specific and measurable contribution to its current level. By burying carbon at extraordinary rates for tens of millions of years, they removed the counterweight that would otherwise have kept oxygen lower. The air that every land animal in the history of this planet has breathed is partly a product of those swamps. Now the coal, sometime in the early 1700s, in a small mining operation in the north of England, a man with a pick broke through into a seam of black rock and brought a piece of it to the surface. People had been burning coal in small quantities for centuries. But what happened in the decades after that moment was different in kind from anything that had come before. The steam engine arrived, then the locomotive, then the factory running on coal-fired boilers, then the expansion of coal mining to match the expansion of machines that needed it. By the middle of the 1700s, Britain was consuming coal at rates that had no precedent. By the early 1800s, the Industrial Revolution was remaking the landscape of northern England and spreading to continental Europe and the northeastern United States. By the end of the 1800s, coal was the primary energy source of an interconnected industrial civilization that had come to depend on it, the way earlier civilizations had depended on wood or animal power. What changed in that century and a half was not just technology or economics or politics. What changed was the rate at which buried carbon was returning to the atmosphere. In the Carboniferous swamps, carbon was buried over tens of millions of years. The atmosphere adjusted to those changes across timescales of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. The planet's climate systems, the feedbacks that regulate carbon dioxide and temperature, evolved to handle perturbations that arrived at geological rates. They can deal with slow. Slow is what they were built for. What the Industrial Revolution introduced was not more carbon than the planet had ever seen in its atmosphere. Across the deep history of Earth, carbon dioxide levels have been higher than today for long periods. What the Industrial Revolution introduced was carbon returning to the atmosphere at a speed that the geological systems regulating climate have no mechanism to respond to quickly. The Carboniferous took 30 million years to bury what we are returning in 3 centuries. The ratio is not 10 to 1 or 100 to 1. It is roughly 100,000 to 1. For every year it took to bury the carbon, about 1/3 of a day is enough to burn it back out. This is not a political observation. It is a statement about timescales. The planet's thermostat is designed for geological time. What is happening now is happening in human time. Those are different categories of speed. And the difference between them is the thing that has no real precedent in the record of what Earth has been through before. The forests buried the carbon slowly. We are returning it quickly. What the planet does with that, how the systems that regulate climate respond to a perturbation arriving at this rate, is something the geological record cannot fully answer, because the geological record contains nothing quite like it. The first forests did not make that choice. They just made the coal. Put the coal down. You have been holding it since the beginning of this story, turning it over, feeling its weight, and now you know what it actually is. Not rock in the ordinary sense. Sunlight from 300 million years ago. Carbon pulled from an atmosphere thicker with greenhouse gas than anything alive today has ever breathed. Wood from trees that grew in swamps before flowers existed, before mammals existed, before anything that looked remotely like a human being had appeared anywhere on this planet. You know how it was made. You know what it cost. You know what the forests did on their way to making it. Step outside. If you are somewhere with natural ground, look down. The soil under your feet is a biological product. It was built by root systems and fungal networks and generations of organisms decomposing into the layer below them. Over timescales that make human history look like a rounding error, the first forests established the template for that process. Every productive landscape on Earth, every place where something grows in ground rich enough to support it, is working with a system those forests pioneered. Look up at whatever trees are visible from where you are standing. Every one of them is a variation on a solution worked out 385 million years ago. When something figured out how to make lignin and use it to grow tall and send roots deep into rock, the architecture of every forest that has ever existed since then. The canopy and the understory and the forest floor and the soil below it descends from that original invention. Wood made all of it possible. Every tree you have ever seen in your life is, in a deep sense, a descendant of Archaeopteryx. Every breath you are taking right now is moving through lungs that belong to a lineage that made it through the Devonian crisis, through lungs that exist in a causal chain, too long and too complicated to hold all at once, but real at every link. Because forests grew roots, and roots sent phosphorus to the sea, and the sea experienced a crisis, and the crisis reshaped which fish survived, and those fish eventually came onto land that the forests had built. You are not separate from this story. You are its current expression. Before the first forests, land was a surface, a place where chemistry happened and simple organisms clung to rock and weather, moved across a basically mineral landscape. The living world was almost entirely a marine phenomenon, with land life as a thin and ecologically shallow addition at the edges. After the first forests, land was an ecosystem, a layered, three-dimensional, biologically complex environment with soil and canopy and everything in between, with nutrient cycles connecting rock chemistry to atmospheric chemistry to ocean chemistry, with habitat for creatures that had never had real habitat before. The forests did not just add trees to the landscape, they added the landscape itself, in the form we recognize as landscape. We did not arrive on a planet and build our civilization on top of it. We arrived in a world that had already been built by something else, built over hundreds of millions of years through processes that had no awareness of what they were constructing, no intention behind any of it, no plan. And we built everything we have ever called civilization on top of that prior construction. The first forests were not conscious. They had no intention. They grew because the conditions for growth existed and because the biological systems driving that growth worked. They changed the world, not by deciding to change it, but by doing what living things do, which is to convert energy and material from one form into another and leave the environment different from how they found it. What they left it as was a planet that could support everything that came after. That planet is the one you were born on. The coal in your hand has been sitting in the ground for 300 million years. It has been through the formation of mountain ranges and the drift of continents and the rise and fall of every civilization that has ever existed. It does not know what it is. It does not know what it was. It has no relationship to its own history. You do. You are the first kind of living thing on this planet that can look back at all of it. At the cyanobacteria, and the Devonian reefs, and the Carboniferous swamps, and the lobe-finned fish dragging themselves onto land, and understand that this is what life does to planets. You are the first living thing capable of knowing its own consequences before they fully arrive. The forests changed everything without knowing what they were doing. What you do with that knowledge is the only part of this story that has not already been written.